Genki Ferguson was born in New Brunswick to a family of writers and grew up in Calgary. He spent much of his childhood in the subtropical island of Kyushu, Japan, where his mother's family still resides. Fluent in Japanese and capable of making a decent sushi roll, Genki recently completed a degree in film production while working part-time at Book Warehouse, an indie store in Vancouver. Okay, so Genki.
Hello. So yes, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm Genki. I wrote Satellite Love, which I believe, are you guys reading it for class or how is that working here? Is it like an optional reading?
For my first year class, it's an optional sort of substitute reading if they don't want to do a final paper on the book I assigned. And
Right.
that has been chosen by a couple of people. And then in the fourth year Asian literature class, it's the second to last book that we're reading and discussing.
Oh, cool. And this is kind of a mix of the two classes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Awesome. All right. So about me, we'll go to the next slide. So I'm Genki Ferguson. I was born in New Brunswick, so close to you guys, and then I grew up in Calgary. Big reader my whole life, predominantly Japanese literature, so I was very excited when I saw your professor's line of research there. I went to film school at Emily Carr, so my whole life I've been kind of slowly moving west. And while at Emily Carr in my first and second year, I wrote Satellite Love, and then I spent the next couple years of Emily Carr not focusing on my studies at all because I was trying to get published, and that kind of takes up your whole life. And I chose this photo here. That's me pre-pandemic with shorter non-pandemic hair. And that's kind of you can see in that photo why I didn't pursue film very much. Because if you look there, you can see all my friends in the background, and pretty much all of them have gone on to film school or gone on to work in film. And there's me in the front, and I didn't. And I'm horribly overexposed, and I probably chose like the worst lighting conditions to prop myself in there. So even in that little photo, you can kind of tell my instincts weren't really with film, unfortunately. However, I did spend a lot of time in Japan growing up. I'm half Japanese on my mother's side, and on my father's side, I'm just kind of like the typical Anglo white Canadian mix, Scottish, Canadian, or Irish, whatever. But not only did I live in Japan, I actually specifically lived in Minamata, which I believe you guys have been studying, right? With Shimura's, I forget her name's writing. And you can see in the next slide there, I have some photos that I've brought here. So that's Minamata. It's a very dear city to me. Uh, can't say there's really a whole lot to it, actually. It's kind of the city that's been, thanks to a combination of post-industrialization and then kind of the ecological crisis, as you'd all know, and then also just the youth base rapidly leaving. It's a city of, I think what was meant to be like 50,000 that shrunk down to 20,000. And anyone who's read Satellite Love might recognize that description because Sakita, where Anna lives and where the whole story is set, is actually pretty much set in Minamata. Originally, I kind of started to write bits of Minamata into it, but I kind of thought, well, I wanted to keep that separate, mostly just out of respect to my family and whatnot. So, but Sakita is essentially Minamata, maybe a bit of an exaggerated version there. In the left photo, you can see I was in Minamata one year, and there's a freak snowstorm. Another perhaps identifiable motif in the novel, which is that in Sakita at the time of Satellite Love, huge snowstorm, the first in like 10 years sweeps through, and that happened while I was there. And they made a very, very little cute Yukidaruma there, a little snowman, much plumper and shorter than the way we do it in the West, but I'm quite fond of him. The next slide, you can see some more photos as well. And that's just the landscape there. My family in Minamata are kind of, they're very much in that like half rural, half urban kind of mix. I think a lot of people when they talk about Japan, or a lot of people who maybe haven't really been to Japan much, when they picture Japan, they think of either hyper urban metro Tokyo, Akihabara, Shibuya, the kind of crazy glitz glam, the like incessant noise of it all, or they picture very quiet, like maybe Kyoto with the koto playing in the background of the tea ceremonies. That's very true. Those parts of Japan do exist, but the Japan I always knew and the Japan I wanted to write about was that of Minamata, which existed kind of halfway between, let's say. And to the right there, that's probably the most like early 2000s Japan photo ever taken. That's me in the middle with a blue jacket, my cousin up top with the glasses were in front of a Mario Kart machine. My brother, always with the swagger, up front with his arms crossed, glaring into the camera. And he's done quite well for himself. He's studying like medicine in Calgary. I'm like, oh, I'm glad you're kind of studying something substantial. So yeah, there's my background. So what I'm going to be kind of doing here with this lecture, I suppose, if we can really call it that, is because you guys are studying Japanese literature, correct?
Asian literature kind of
Asian
more
literature as a
broadly,
whole. Gotcha.
but we've focused on Japanese literature for the most part because that's what I'm most interested in. So we'll do the vegetarian, which is
Oh,
Korean after this.
yeah, yeah.
And we did an anthology of Chinese poetry at the start. So, but aside from that, it's been Japanese literature.
Cool, cool, cool. The vegetarian's great. And yeah, I mean, I try to read widely, but Japanese literature is definitely what I read most of and what I kind of appreciate most, at least. So I'll be focusing on that. Oh, and also, otherwise I'll just be up here talking to myself for quite a while. If there's any questions or anything, or I'm happy to take tangents or just throw them out there. And this is just a kind of guide. So yeah, I'll be talking about satellite love, and I'll be talking about what I see are maybe the three markers in my mind, three of the main markers of Japanese fiction. And I'm breaking it down into theory, let's say, of what the theory is, I guess, like what I was thinking of, and what maybe the kind of cultural basis of a lot of Japanese fiction is. And then I'm also going to break it down into practice, like how did in the writing of Satellite Love, how did I try to kind of embody these, or how did I try to utilize these techniques? Um, so we'll go to the next slide, and next slide here is vital materialism, which is a phrase I just recently learned from your professor. Actually, was the presence of kami, and I thought that was perfect because so much of Japanese literature, even if it doesn't explicitly mention Shintoism, talks about kami, and talks about the relationship of gods and spirits. And certainly, Satellite Love is the story of a young girl who falls in love with an object. She falls in love with Leo, and it's kind of hinted throughout, but it's never explicitly stated. But maybe Leo could be a kami, or maybe he's a figment of her imagination. In a sense, it doesn't really matter, but there's a couple different possible answers as to who Leo is and how he's kind of manifested in this form. So for the first one, I'm going to point out kami and how they exist in Japanese literature. So we can go to the next slide here. So yeah, kami. So one of the things with Japanese literature or Japanese culture as a whole is that the way religions tackle is perhaps unique to the way we tackle it here in the West, where people are more likely to specify that they're of a certain delineation, even if they're not very devout. Let's say, even if they only go to church on like Christmas, for instance, or really only go on Sunday and don't think about any other time, they still very much would say, "Oh, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, or what have you." In Japan, while there's still very much that kind of system of belief, Shintoism as a whole, you'd maybe be hard pressed to find someone who would specifically call themselves a Shintoist. And yet, much of Japan celebrates and goes through these rituals, especially like the first shrine visit of the year, for instance, or the buying of the little omamori charms. So, in this sense, Shintoism has become kind of, I guess, absorbed into the cultural fabric. And I'm not speaking as an expert here. I'm speaking as someone who wrote a book about Shintoism. So if there's any contradictory information, go with that. But so what is Shintoism? Shinto is Japan's oldest native religion. And over time, there's no real central doctrine that you can point to. The closest thing you could argue they have is the Kojiki, which is a collection of myths and fairy tales from way back when that essentially kind of described the creation of Japan, among many other things, and in a sense kind of justified the position of the imperial family, of the emperor and empress's rule over Japan. And over time, these myths started to become adapted, or you could say they developed parallel into a more organized system called Shintoism. And from my research and just from my own experience, it's less about doctrine and more about practice in that sense, where a Shinto ceremony, let's say you go to there's certain routines you'd have to go to. So you go, you clap your hands a couple times, you ring the bell, you throw a coin in. It's more of a routine in the sense that the act of doing something develops this faith. And I thought a great kind of modern example that pairs with this is Ruth Ozeki, The Book of Form and Emptiness. And Ruth Ozeki is someone I owe a great deal to. She's a lovely person. Have you guys read Ruth Ozeki in this class, or you must have talked about her before? No? Oh,
We
she's
we haven't read her in this class. I have the Book of Form and Emptiness with me because I thought you might have read it because you mentioned it was coming out, and that was when I got her library.
yeah.
But
No, Ruth is fantastic. She's a friend of mine actually, and really kind of the largest reason why Satellite Love got published. She read an early draft of it and offered so much support. And Ruth Ozeki is not just a novelist; she's also a Zen Buddhist priest, which is incredible. And when you meet her, you very much get this aura of a Zen Buddhist priest from her. She's very calm. She's very wise. There's something eternal about her as a person. And her newest novel came out, The Book of Form and Emptiness. And the plot here, or the kind of central conceit, let's say, is a young boy, after witnessing the tragic death of his father, starts to hear voices. Everyday objects in the world start to talk to him. And one of the kind of core tenets of Shintoism is that everything has a kami inside. And a kami is a spirit or a soul. It's not quite a god, but it's not quite just like a ghost, let's say. It's what it is, it's a kami. It has its own word. Um, and one of the central tenets is that everything has a kami in it. The mountains, the wind, the water, even the sounds you make, they have kami inside. Everything exists with kami. Everything lives and breathes. Now, Ruth Ozeki, she's a Buddhist, and yet she wrote a book that seems to really be very much aligned with Shintoism here. And I actually haven't asked her this myself, but I'm sure she could corroborate, is that in Japan, a lot of one of the reasons Buddhism was able to spread so successfully is that it so often was able to and willing to adapt the stories and the myths of the existing cultures and countries that it kind of spread to. So one could argue, rather than trying to oppress and kind of beat down the predominant religion, it instead began the maybe more insidious process of absorbing it. So in Shintoism, we have the stories of the kami. We have Amaterasu, for example, who plays a big role in Satellite Love, or Osuno Arashiri, I don't remember the name as well, who's her brother, the god of storm seas. When Buddhism comes to Japan, instead it takes these myths and says, no, these aren't just your kami, these are bodhisattvas, these are our gods as well, these are our saints, and they have multiple forms. And that's kind of one of the beauties of how Buddhism was able to spread so widely. So even though Ruth Ozeki is a Buddhist, first and foremost, she's a Zen Buddhist priest. She's the most Buddhist person you can possibly meet. Her story still has these kind of kami elements incorporated into it, and it's a really beautiful story. I highly recommend it. Book of Form and Emptiness came out alongside with Satellite Love, but her novel, A Tale for the Time Being, was a huge kind of inspiration and kind of touch point for me while I was writing my novel. And I have a quote there at the bottom from Ruth, and I think this quote. Oh, okay, never mind. So throughout the book itself talks to you, which is kind of interesting. It's like the physical book you're talking to speaks to you as a book, and we'll come back to that later. But this quote here is from a character named the Philosopher. He says, "Where do you think poems come from? Everything speaks, young schoolboy, but is only poets and prophets, saints and philosophers who have the ears to hear," as she writes in his accent. And that's kind of, I would argue that in Japanese literature, this is a theme you see often, the kind of predominance of nature speaking, of object speaking, of even worship. You can even point towards, what was her name? The KonMari method. He's talking about how to clean your house. He says what you must do is thank every object for its service before throwing it away. That's very much, I would say, argue a Shinto ideal. So that's the theory. And I'm going to move on now to the practice here. So that's the next slide. Perfect. So theory, Japanese aesthetics are informed by a distinct relationship to kami and therefore the world. When you believe that everything around you has a soul, exists as a kind of god or spirit, well, that definitely informs the way you move about it. And I mean, if you go to Japan, you'll see that it's not necessarily a nature worshipping country like anywhere else in the world. There's heavy industrialization, but that I would argue that that kind of that tickling of the consciousness, let's say, the conscience, sorry, um, leads to kind of really severe alienation with the environment that you can read later on in the books or later on in their fiction, especially like in the post-war Meiji era. So theory, Japanese aesthetics are informed by a distinct relationship to kami and therefore the world. So in practice, how did I incorporate that in satellite love? Well, first of all, satellite love is to mirror the kind of alienation that Anna feels. Anna Obata is the main character. She falls in love with a satellite that flies over her home, and she herself feels very alienated from the world. To kind of mirror that, I've set her in a post-industrial Japan. Sakita is a city that's just on the verge of, or just maybe failed to fully industrialize. And a big question that pops up is, can man-made objects have kami? It's a given that the mountains have kami, the trees have kami, the wind has kami. But what if you take the earth and you mold it and turn it into a car or a hammer or a satellite? Does that still have its original soul? Does the human hand add or subtract something, or does it not interfere at all? And in that case, then can we still maintain a holistic relationship to our environment when we're rapidly changing it and meddling in it, let's say? Another way I kind of, and this is actually a technique I use to introduce everything I'm talking about to an audience that may not be as familiar. Soki, another one of the boys there, or another one of the characters in the book, it's a hardcore Shinto child. He's a son of a Shinto priest. And in Japan, and I think with a lot of Buddhist traditions as well, I think in Korea it works the same way. But with Shintoism, priesthood is hereditary. So in Abrahamic religions, let's say you have to study and work your way up to it. I'm not as familiar, but to become a priest, you have to know your stuff. It's a position you work up to. Priesthood in Shintoism and Buddhism, at least as far as I'm aware of, is hereditary. Your father is a priest, you become a priest, your son becomes a priest, and so on and so forth. And what this leads to is a weird tension where, again, like one could argue that the meaning of the rituals become further divorced, as you maybe don't always have the most devout people practicing or preaching, even though they go through the motions as well. But the question is, can the motions themselves of praying, of ringing the bells properly, of knowing the prayers and saying the words correctly, can that lead to belief? Some would argue yes, and maybe Ruth Ozeki might as well, with the way she talks about sound having meaning and form. So Soki is kind of a gateway for the average, for the maybe non-aware reader who wouldn't know as much about Shintoism. He's a very, very curious, intensely Shinto child. Probably not many people actually exist like him, but by kind of offering him just as a purely kind of mercenary technique when I'm writing there, by writing him in such a way, he kind of serves as a gateway into this whole world, and he's curious and actively probes these questions that his father's maybe taken for granted. And then, of course, the final way, the most obvious way I've kind of integrated this is in Anna, the girl who loves a satellite as a substitute for human affection. So she loves the satellite. She loves Leo, who flies above her home. And she's not sure if she's a kami or not. She's not even fully concerned with that. But what she does know is that she loves an object. And as far as she's concerned, that's a substitute for human affection. So how are we doing so far? Is this kind of what how's everyone doing?
Good.
We're doing good. Cool. So I actually had a writing exercise, I think, for this one, if we're all willing to try something like that out. Get the muscles, blood flowing. It's on the next slide there. Writing exercise. So write about the perspective, or write from the perspective of an object. If you can think of one, a household appliance will do. So this was a challenge while writing Satellite Love, is how do I write from the perspective of a satellite? Clearly that's like an odd thing to be writing from. And it's something I struggled with quite a bit. When you're writing a book like Satellite Love, which has so many different characters and different voices, it's crucial to keep these voices distinct. And Soki, I kind of solved that pretty early. He speaks with a very clipped tone. He speaks short sentences. He often drops the subject. He talks in a very kind of clipped manner. The grandfather, for instance, who's a character who's suffering from dementia, he speaks in present tense. So all the rest of the book is in past tense, kind of retrospectively remembering Anna walked to the store, Anna did this. The grandfather scenes are all in present tense. I did this, or I go here, I do this, I did that, or I do this, I do that, I eat this. He's very much in the moment because all he's capable of doing is living in the moment. But then there's the matter of Anna and the satellite, and they're very similar kind of voices, the satellite is a manifestation of Anna's kind of hopes and desires. So how do I write that? How do I distinguish the voices? And I was struggling with that for quite a while, and I came to a key realization. I was reading Haruki Murakami's collection of short stories, Men Without Women. And one of the stories there, and it's a pretty solid collection as far as he's concerned. One of the stories is called Samsa in Love. And it's kind of a riff on Kafka's Metamorphosis. If anyone's not familiar, I'm sure everyone kind of is. Metamorphosis, the story of a man who wakes up one morning and finds out that he's a beetle. He realizes that he's turned into a giant insect. Murakami flipped the script on this, and he wrote it from the perspective of a beetle who wakes up and realizes he's a human. And I was reading this as I was going through the edits of Satellite Love, and I thought, oh, this is how you do it. This is how you write from a non-human perspective. And I thought it was brilliant. And there's one of the things he does is he kind of channels what would a beetle be worried about. So right here at the bottom, we can say a quote from the story: "He couldn't lie there staring up at the ceiling forever. The posture left him much too vulnerable. He had no chance of surviving an attack by predatory birds, for example. So even though he's a human, he's still worried about birds." And I thought that was brilliant. And in Satellite Love, that's kind of one of the things Leo does. When he looks down at humans, he thinks their fleshy forms are kind of quaint, and how is that going to protect you from a solar flare? And then I started going further with that. Well, how would a satellite think? What's a satellite's subjectivity like? Well, in this case, a satellite would be concerned with numbers, for instance. It would be very exact and mathematical. So whereas another person might say, oh, we walked 10 minutes to the train station, the satellite would say we walked exactly 562 meters to the train station. So little things like that peppered throughout. But that's something you can actually push even further too. Like, how does a satellite see the world? Well, a satellite might be kind of like a weird, slightly paranoid type. If he's always seeing things, then surely he would be conscious of being seen himself. And we can extrapolate on that. Would an oven be angry or patient? I would wager patient. It takes a long time to use an oven, I guess. Would a stick bug be wise or sneaky? I would say sneaky because they can hide in the jungle, but maybe be wise because it's seen a lot of things from its time. There's no right answer to this, I suppose, but maybe we can open this up and everyone, how long should we give this, you think? 15 minutes?
What do you think? Yeah?
Okay, that sounds good.
Cool. If we're all down for a writing exercise. In the meantime, I'll find a passage to illustrate this from. Cool. Well, maybe if there's anyone who wants to share. If not, I can start it off by sharing myself, just so it's not fully. I realized it was kind of cruel to assign a writing exercise and then just sit here and not do anything. But I still didn't write anything. I just found an old story, so we'll have to go with that. So around the time I was working with Satellite Love, we spent a lot of time between edits, so you can get kind of antsy. So I wrote a little short story called "The Girl Who Was Raised by Butterflies." And it's fairly long actually, but it's about a girl who's raised by butterflies. Kind of like you hear stories about boys who are raised by wolves, or can't think of any other examples. So there's boys who are raised by wolves. Here's a girl who's raised by a butterfly, and it's kind of about nonconformity and her attempt to kind of fit back in with the world. Probably pretty familiar to people who've read Satellite Love. So here's a little excerpt from that, and kind of what I was thinking of how to write non-human forms. I only consume brightly colored liquids. Morneau knows this, which is why I always stop by his cafe on the way to work. He's very kind about my condition. He never judges me and always makes sure my order looks perfect. When I take the tea from his thick, trunk-like arms, oh, if only they were long and spindly instead, I notice he has done something extra to my tea. Floating on top of that bright purple water are a couple chrysanthemums, staring up at me. The soft light that filters through those seldom cleaned windows illuminates his shop, revealing the flecks of dust which float and settle on the dated cherrywood countertops. I always make sure to tip Morneau a bit extra, even though he says it's not necessary. The sheer amount of food coloring he uses must make me his most expensive customer. That day, Morneau had a human-lapped larva standing next to him, nose peeking out from behind the piles of stale muffins and biscuits. Children love to stare at me on account of the vibrant colors I dress myself in. Morneau notices this and smiles proudly. Clara, this is my grandson Samuel, he says, gruff voice coming from behind that bush-like mustache. So, Morneau has procreated after all. I lean over, staring into Samuel's wide-open eyes. He could almost pass for an insect himself. He seems scared. You don't look like a butterfly, he mumbles. I laugh, for I know this is how you hide when words hurt you. Larvae don't know much better. Of course not. Physically speaking, I am a human, I reply. But is it true? I feign ignorance, for this is how you play with children. Is what true? That you are raised by butterflies? I look up at Morneau, who seems embarrassed, and beneath my skin, I feel my lateral muscles twitch, searching for wings that aren't there. So that's the end of that little passage there. A little bit different than I guess what I mentioned, but kind of how I wrote like in Satellite Love, how to write a non-human character. Clara in this story talks kind of stilted, like she's observing everything for the first time because to her the human world is what's odd and the insect world is what's normal. Morneau has big, nice forearms, which I'm pretty sure like a positive trait, and she wishes they were long and spindly like an insect's legs. And she, of course, dresses in bright colors, only drinks bright colors like a butterfly. That's all she's attracted to. And she calls babies larvae. So something like that. Was there anyone who wanted to share their work?
Okay, this is Thomas.
Hello.
Hi, Thomas. I love your laptop. You got all those stickers. I recognize Isabel, and I can't really see it, but I see some Eevees there. And
Thanks.
the blue guy, his name is like a Wyak or something like that. I dig it.
Thanks for calling me out.
It's a good thing, man. I'm playing I play my games too. All right. So what do you have for us?
Okay, so I wrote this from the perspective of a wingnut from a ride-on lawnmower.
I love it already.
My life began toppling through the air for a short distance before landing unceremoniously on a patch of flattened grass. I say my life began, but it was more a realization that I could be anything else other than not alive. As before my short tumble, I was concerned merely with existing in a rigid state and thus fulfilling my deepest desire. Now, though, I had other concerns. A rumbling below me and something blinding above me. An ache from where I was once attached to 18 and 19, and the nagging fear that whoever or whatever was using the machine I was once a part of was in danger, and more importantly, that I would never be able... Oh, hang on a second. More importantly, would never be able to find me and place me back where I belong. I was only ever made to feel the vibrations from the motor, not the coolness of grass against what they might call a cheek. I was only meant to be bathed in oil, not morning dew. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. And with each passing second, this new thing called anxiety built up inside me. The humming of the motor grew further, then closer, then further, and closer again. With each pass, I expected to hear a final whirring grinding and see a triple-bladed assembly fly out of the bottom of the machine and hit someone. I hoped it was me. The moment never came, and eventually the motor stopped. No more for today. But the next? Why didn't it fail? My purpose was important, I knew that. My absence was supposed to mean catastrophe. This filled me with a new anxiety. Was I necessary?
I love it. That's great. I see what you're doing too. Like a wingnut from was it a ride-on lawnmower you said? Would be
Yep.
very concerned solely with its purpose in life. I mean, it's built for one thing and one thing only, so it'd be pretty alarming to have to do anything else. Yeah, I like that. I love what was that little detail you put in between 18 and 19? What could you
Yes.
repeat that?
An ache from where I was once attached to 18 and 19. That would
Yeah,
be
that's great.
the
It's like-
washer and the screw, I guess.
Yeah, I love that because you get a little like hint of like you aren't being overly kind of didactic with it. Where I used to be attached to the wing to the washer and whatever that I once called 18 and 19, you just go for whereas connected to 18 and 19, and then of course as the audience we infer, okay, so this is place in the world, and of course by giving it numbers, it's all with order. That's great. I loved it.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I feel like I truly know what it's like to be a wingnut now. Is there anything else? Anyone else wanted to share a piece?
We have some other writers in the room. I know that.
Yeah, is this a creative writing class as well, partially, or?
No, it's not, but there's Thomas writes, Laura writes. There might be other people who write.
A
you wanna read
lot of
yours,
people,
Laura?
more than you'd think, would write. Yeah.
Do you want to read yours? I'm putting someone on the spot here.
Oh, yes.
I saw lots of writing going on.
Well, if no one feels comfortable sharing, I'm happy to move on from here too. That was a good piece that we heard.
Okay. No takers? Okay.
Well, everyone, I'm sure, wrote something very great. And yeah, like, so there's more writers than we think in the world. I didn't tell anyone I was writing Saddle Love until I was done it because I felt very like deeply ashamed of it. So you never know. So yeah, that was kind of, maybe you kind of got a glimpse of what it's like to write a non-human character in that sense. So we'll move on. That's kind of how I would say kami manifest in Japanese fiction. So to kind of point that further, voice, inner world versus outer world, or the Japanese tension of old versus new. Again, I'm not a historian or an academic by any means. I am someone who just has a casual interest in these kinds of things and then happen to have written about it. So yeah, you could argue that a large chunk of Japanese history, or pretty much all history really, but especially Japanese history, has been about this kind of pull, this tension between the old and the new. We see it starting with kind of the Meiji era, with Perry coming in and forcing open the gates. Anyone who might not know much about Japanese history, long, long ago, Japan was completely boarded off. It was a kind of warring states period. Samurai and daimyo and all that kind of romantic imagery from the time originates from here, where Japan's very insular and didn't want to kind of contact with the outside world. And then in the Meiji period, they were forced to basically. They finally opened their doors to the world, and in the process went through what some might argue was a renaissance, and others might argue was a loss of national character. Actually, we can go to the next slide. I think probably talk about this. Yeah, here we go. So Meiji era. So yeah, how much did Japan want to take from the Western world, and how much did it want to keep Japanese? And for the first time, Japan was, or maybe one of the first times, Japan was forced to ask itself, what is Japanese? All these things we take for granted, does it have value? If it has value, then why does it have value? And or is it more valuable than the Western method of doing things? And some of my favorite fiction comes at this time. Some of the best writers in Japanese history have been from here. So we got Natsume Soseki here, who for a while was on the 1,000 yen bill in Japan. He wrote classic novels such as Kokoro, which is about the relationship between a teacher and a student, really beautiful novel. I'm a Cat, which is a kind of funny satirical look at this changing, tension-filled world from the eyes of a cat. And then my personal favorite of his is Sanshiro, which is kind of a minor work of his, and I think a little bit unpopular. But it's basically a coming of age story about a young man who comes from Kyushu, where my family resides, to Tokyo. And he kind of sees for the first time the rapid westernization of Japan. So it's kind of this coming of age story set against the backdrop of, maybe you could even argue, is like a coming of age of modern Japanese history, in a sense. So a very large chunk of classic Japanese literature kind of originates from here. And that other image I have there was a radical, at least for the time, feminist magazine called Blue Stocking. Really, really fascinating stuff. And unfortunately, not a lot of it's translated. But if you speak Japanese or read Japanese, I strongly urge you to look it up. Or I'm sure you can find information in English too. Blue Stocking, while Natsume Soseki maybe argue that there was pros and cons to this, and he felt a lot of inner anguish about what maybe we were losing as a country and what they were gaining. And the kind of the cost of this enlightenment, if you could call it that. Blue Stockings had a much different approach. They saw the kind of progressiveness of the West comparatively at the time, and they saw that maybe women didn't have to be treated the way women were treated back then. So it was a very radical magazine. They were constantly being shut down, and there was like a double murder, suicide, and I think someone lit their building on fire, and bookstores were threatened to not carry them. And it lasted not even that long. It kind of had a short but vibrant life. But they wrote stories, for example, if talking about a woman's right to abortion or a woman's right to marry for love even was like that alone was super contentious and got them shut down, I believe. I don't have all the history worked out, but he wrote all these things about a woman's right to just enjoy relationships as a whole. And some very interesting, very intense writers came out of this period. And if you look at their contributors list and then kind of see what they ended up writing later, some of those authors went on to become really enormous powerhouses. So that's the first tension, right? To westernize or stay Japanese. We can see there's a quote there at the bottom from Saseki. I believe that we young men of the new age have encountered the moment in time when we must call for the great freedom, the freedom of the mind. That's taken from Sanshiro. It's a funny book, but it's a beautiful, beautiful coming of age story. So that's maybe one example of historical tension. So here's the next slide here. And this is a popular one, especially now. From what I understand, the TikTok teens are reading No Longer Human, which makes me very happy. So post-war, the samurai spirit is shattered, or what counts as strength. So this clearly post-World War II, Japan suffers from a very agonizing, some might say humiliating defeat. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are bombed. Tokyo is relentlessly firebombed. Everyone's living in poverty. If anyone's seen like the movie Grave of the Fireflies, you kind of get it's animated, but you get a sense for the times. And what you have to understand is that prior to this, in the kind of raw militarism that was emerging, the onset of the war, there was this great idea of like Japanese exceptionalism, especially coming down from the imperial family, and the imperial family is given divine right thanks to Shintoism, the myth of Amaterasu, for instance, who comes down and proclaims and creates Japan, let's say. But then after World War II, which, there's a lot of debate about how hard Japan was willing to fight, and especially when it comes to the question of the nuclear bomb, like was it justified or not? But how far had this kind of militarism gone? What did the average person think? And so when the emperor gets on the radio, and this is the first time people are hearing his voice, and he says that the war is over, and then later they have to sacrifice their divine rule and say that they aren't descended from Amaterasu, they aren't descendants of gods. That's a tremendous blow to the ego, to the national ego, to the national spirit. And it's really thanks to that blow that we have some really lurid psychological writing. So I have here Yukio Mishima as the sailor who fell from grace with the sea, and Osamu Dazai is No Longer Human. Both very intense psychological reads, very much worth reading, especially this one from Mishima. Mishima, for me, can be hit or miss, but this one's great, in my personal opinion. Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea is about this young, creepy little boy who exhibits signs of being a serial killer from a young age. His mother, a Japanese woman, starts an affair with an American GI who's been stationed in Japan. And as he sees this, at first he rejoices. He loves that his mother's dating this military man, because he sees it as kind of restoration of Japanese power, or look, we're going to get it back. Or he doesn't see it that way, but metaphorically, that's what Mishima's talking about. And then at the end, he becomes disillusioned, and it ends very shockingly, let's say, with what happens between the three characters. Mishima himself was a big proponent of restoring kind of the emperor's divine right and restoring Japanese militarism. If you don't know who Mishima is, really recommend looking him up. There's even a movie made of him, of his biopic made of his life. But Mishima, spoiler alert, he died in real life. And how he died is that him and a group of student radicals, he was older by then, but he led a group of young radicals, stormed, I don't remember where they stormed, but they stormed some government building. I think they took a mayor or someone hostage. You have to look up the details on this. But he goes out and gives a speech to the military who's gathered around him and say, we must reunite to Japan and come all together, blah, 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 blah. And they cheer at him and they laugh at him. That whole spirit that he wished for was dead. So he goes back into a private room and he commits seppuku. He cuts his stomach open with a samurai sword. And that's the end of Mishima in real life. So his fiction, similarly, is pretty messed up. Osamu Dazai too, I won't go as long into his bio, but he's also a very peculiar person. He very much felt alienated with the world, and numerous suicide attempts and an attempted murder charge and all that. But he was also growing up living in a similar time. So here's a quote from his novel, No Longer Human. What is society but an individual? The ocean is not society, it is individuals. That is how I managed to gain a modicum of freedom from my terror, the illusion of the ocean called the world. So when the world is changing around you, and when you don't recognize where you're living in anymore, or the world that you thought existed is now completely gone or shattered, where do you turn but inwards? And maybe this is where readers start to seek solace as well, as in these characters who dare say or express the really dark, kind of maybe even depraved feelings that they themselves couldn't express as human beings living in the real world and not in a novel. So, and I'll go to the next slide here, which takes us to modern day. Here's some, let's see, 21st century. And this is my own personal, like, who knows how the future is going to see the past kind of thing. But we got Sayaka Murata here. Did you guys study Sayaka Murata? No.
No, there wasn't time to. It's one of my
Oh, okay.
favorite. Both of those are favorites of mine too. And
Oh,
I
they're
just look
great.
back because I passed on the Breasts and Eggs to somebody to read, and I was just like, "Did you read it?"
It's a great novel. It's really fantastic. And then I'm not like, yeah, again, I'm not an authority on these things. So, but yeah, Sayaka Murata, Miyako Kawakami, two of the most exciting writers right now. There's like a big, it's a big moment for like contemporary female writers in Japan. I mean, these two especially are kind of like the two figureheads. But if you dig deeper, the Eto Mori, and I'm not going to be able to name anyone else because I put myself on the spot right now. But yeah, definitely, this is a good time to be reading a Japanese women's literature, let's say. So we have two examples here, and what I would argue personally about 21st century's alienation is this alienation from our bodies, from our labor, and from our environment. And a lot of this would be brought on from, let's say, now we're like from like late stage capitalism, super far beyond like industrialization. Now everything's just industrial. We're all digital now. What has value? Where do we find meaning when there's nothing else, or when it feels like there's nothing else? So I'll give a brief synopsis of the two. Convenience Store Woman is a very short novella, and I strongly recommend it to everyone. It's about a woman who works in a convenience store, and all she wants to do is work at a convenience store, but the world won't let her work at the convenience store because she's 30, she's pushing 30, or she's early 30s now. She's working at a job, a dead-end job, let's say, at a convenience store. She's doing fine for herself economically. She has her own apartment, but she doesn't have a boyfriend. She doesn't have a husband. No thoughts of the biological clock is ticking, as her mother kind of points out to her. But all she wants to do is contribute to society in the only way she knows how, and that is working at a convenience store. But the world won't let her. Breasts and Eggs is similar as well here, and then this is kind of where the intersection of economics and gender and environment kind of meet, and if you'll find a million more people talk about this much more intelligently than I can here. Breasts and Eggs is a story, and I don't remember the characters' names, of a woman who has a single woman, low income, let's say. She's working kind of odd jobs, not really making much for herself. And one day her sister comes with her daughter. Her daughter's 13, her sister's daughter, her main character's niece is 13 years old, and she's gone completely mute. And she doesn't want to speak anymore. And her sister is telling her that the sister wants to get breast surgery. She wants to get breast enhancement surgery. And she's, again, 35, 30 something. And the main character just can't wrap her head around this. Like, why would you be needing this surgery now? And then at the same time, here's her daughter who's going through puberty and refuses to say a word, refuses to speak at what she kind of perceives to be disgust at her mother's actions. And there's really not much that happens in either of these stories, but they're tremendous reads. And I only described the first half of Breasts and Eggs here. There's a second half, but I'll just stick to the first half. But they're incredible reads. Not much really happens, kind of like how not much really happens in No Longer Human or Sanshiro. A lot happens in Mishima's books, but a lot of these books, a lot of Japanese fiction, is nothing happening in a really, really interesting way. And I would argue that that comes from this kind of inner alienated voice that arises. These characters are all so isolated from their environment. And what develops kind of like in the way, like if I can use a really corny metaphor here, like a coal turns into a diamond under pressure. Sayaka Murata's characters all have such interesting dialogue, and Miyako Kawakami's stories all have such interesting dialogue. And what ties all these novels together is that they're in first person, which is much more common than third person fiction in Japan. And I'd have to look at the statistics for that, but I would wager that compared to here, I think I see a lot more third person fiction in the West than I do in Japan. So that's the theory, right? conflict, or over time, we have these conflicts between the inner world and the outer world. How does that manifest in our fiction? Well, when you feel alienated from your outer world, when you don't understand the world, when you're no longer living in the world that you were raised to live in, and certainly I've felt that way recently, and maybe a lot of you guys do too, what comes out is a really intense, vibrant monologue. So the next slide here, how that happened in practice was, just get to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so theory. Intense voice and monologue is created and rewarded by tension in the outer world. And by rewarded, I mean people read it. People read these books, right? It's all good to write something, but more than writing, it's kind of been approved by the collective consciousness, let's say, right? Everyone loved, and in Japan, lots of people loved and read Breast and Eggs, Convenience Store Woman. I think Dazai got famous. No, Dazai was famous while he was alive too. So all these authors were rewarded while they were alive. They weren't geniuses, tormented geniuses that were rewarded after. Their writing was hugely popular, even if most of them did end up like dying tragic deaths. So in practice, how did I incorporate that into Satellite Love? Well, Satellite Love is set on the cusp of the new millennium. I very deliberately placed it the year 1999, and halfway through the book, at a pivotal plot point, it switches. Now we're in the year 2000, right when Anna's kind of at her lowest, let's say. And that kind of switch is now you are officially in the modern world. You're officially joined the 21st century, and there's no going back. All that, only alienation awaits her from this point. And Anna's voice, I tried to write her, and I kind of hope I succeeded with this. She has a very intense, bitter dialogue, and I took a lot of inspiration from old Japanese fiction for this. She's not a likely character for a Meiji or post-war era novel, a 16-year-old girl, but I would say that she shares quite a bit with Mishima and Dazai's characters. At least I attempted to emulate that kind of voice. But then more than that, how do you find meaning in an alienated world? How do you find meaning in a meaningless world? Not to get super depressing here, but that's what these characters are struggling with. And Anna, Soki, and Leo all have different answers. And one of the big reasons why I didn't specify whether Leo was a kami or not, whether he was purely Anna's imagination or not, whether he was real or unreal, was because the answer isn't important. It's the act of belief or the act of longing, let's say. So Anna, Sophie, Leo, all the characters in this book are missing something, or they feel lonely, or they feel solitude. They all grasp for it in different ways. For Anna, it's in the presence of an imaginary friend, an imaginary boyfriend, specifically. For Soki, it's in religion. He's, he wants to know if the kami are real, and the environment that's become so alien to him. I've been saying alien a lot, but in this completely alien environment, can there still be gods, or have they abandoned us? And Leo too, he doesn't know who he is. So is this girl, Anna, is he just a figment of her imagination? Does he treat her as a god or as a friend or his love? Where do you go from there? And these are open-ended questions. I wrote it not even really knowing the answer myself. That's the funny thing about writing a book, is that you don't really get to the answer. You just understand your questions more clearly. So here's a quote from the bottom there. You could almost pinpoint the exact year people lost hope here by the leftover fragments of late 80s Japan, or late 80s design, rather. So all throughout Sakita, it's been kind of frozen. And even though it's in the 21st century, it's going through, and there's like posters and billboards from the 80s. That's the last time that Sakita was able to really develop. So that's that one. I've been talking a while. Is there anything we should do to break it up? Any questions? Anyone have point? Anyone want to like viciously argue against what I've been saying? Because I'll definitely take that. I'm curious.
Well, I found your question about whether non-human, non-natural, like human-made objects have kami, and that discussion and speculation about it really, really interesting. Is that part of a larger dialogue about that? Or is that just something, not just the gods departing, but like, what is the spirit of these things, these machines, this architecture?
Yeah. What's funny is that I wrote that as a kind of a central question, but Shintoism doesn't really have a central doctrine, but the consensus actually is yes. Shintoists believe that everyday objects have souls. And honestly, you could Google it and find the answer in 5 seconds, but that's not why you read a novel. And yeah, the general, and I would maybe say that it would be impossible to continue believing in that faith otherwise. If you thought that the world was losing all its gods, how would you go on? If every time you see, I would argue that that was an answer given maybe out of necessity, let's say. So yeah, Soki, that's something he really very much deals with. He's moved as well in the story. He's originally from up north in Aomori, I believe, is where I placed him. And then he's just a throwaway line, but he slowly traces his way south until he lands in Sakira. And he has no idea why he's here. His father, who doesn't even believe, still finds it kind of morally reprehensible what's happened to this city. And yeah, I mean, again, it's one of those things where you have the answer to the question, but it's the way you get to the answer that has value.
Yeah, because Ruth, yeah, I was thinking of it in relation to Ruth Ozaki's The Book of Form and Emptiness, and particularly that point where the attempt to connect with the story of the table that has this history, and it's not so much Cami as the history of emotion, it seems, or people's stories that have imbued it with story. And
yeah.
that seems somewhat different to me in the answer. Like it's something that humans bring to it rather than something that yeah, because I mean, how in nature, if there's spirits that exist in nature in connection to flowers and trees and water, but then when does the kami or the spirit come to the created object, and how does it
Yeah, exactly. I see what you mean. Like, is it a direct kind of one-to-one transfer or something new created? And I suppose that was kind of one of the questions in Silent Love too, is can human touch, can interaction create something new in a spiritual sense? So Anna's touch, let's say, creates Anna's touch creates Soki, or creates Leo, creates the satellite in her imagination. And later she tries to kind of physically manifest that when she makes the Tengu, this enormous kind of rocket ship built out of trash and out of fridge and whatnot. So yeah, I would say so too. Ruth Ozeki also would bring to it an interesting kind of Buddhist perspective, that being of moments and perpetual kind of birth and birth and death and birth and rebirth. The best way that I've had it described to me, the best way that I've come to understand the Buddhist conception of this is, let's say you have an apple, and if you leave an apple on a counter for a week, it'll become moldy. And if you leave it for a year, it'll just become it'll dissolve into dirt, right? But it's not like that switch happens instantly. So obviously somewhere between the apple and the rotten apple, there's a period where it flips, but not really, because halfway through it's a partially rotten apple. Okay, well, between that, and you can keep dividing it closer and closer until you realize that every single moment this apple is becoming something new. And not just every single second contains thousands and thousands and thousands of moments. That's kind of how I've come to understand it. So I remember that passage, right? Yeah, it seemed to me that Ruth Ozeki was also talking about the way that this, with every moment that passes, this table takes on new meaning and takes on new characteristics with the humans that are also constantly being born and reborn around it. And I mean, she's the Buddhist, so I'd have to ask her. But that's how I understood that passage, at least.
Any questions?
All good. I have more slides. So yeah, we'll go. Okay, so this is the last kind of. Well, how are we doing for time, by the way?
we can go on for a little while longer. Yeah, we don't have any kind of strict time.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, we're nearing the end here, so I'm happy to stick around for however long if there's more conversations. But I'm reaching the end of my presentation at least.
Great.
So yeah, and this is the final, in my mind, kind of marker of Japanese literature being dreams, which is a very romantic way of putting it. Fiction higher than truth. And what I mean by that specifically is magic realism. So we can go to the next slide here. And magic realism, in my mind, kind of combines the previous two factors as well. So magic realism, a lot of different ways to define it, but some would say it's fiction or a story set in a very much real world, which takes on magical characteristics, or it's a world that's 95% recognizable, except for maybe your body separating from your soul at night, or something along those lines. And magic realism is a very potent and powerful theme recurring in Japanese literature, especially contemporary literature, but I would argue it goes quite a ways back as well. So what about magic realism is so, let's say, tempting to maybe Japanese writers at the time? Again, this is all a generalization. For every author I point out, there's a million exceptions, but generally speaking. Well, in magic realism, the boundaries between the real and the real are erased, right? So there's no limit to what you can think or what you can say or what can happen to someone. This is especially common in Japan's most popular novelist at the moment, Haruki Murakami, who writes so much and is read by so widely, and has really kind of brought Japanese magic realism to the Western eye, let's say. So by the same kind of method that the real and the unreal is erased, so are the boundaries between the inner and the outer, or humans and gods, us and the kami, us and our environment, or our inner voice and the outer voice. And by writing in this way, you can more directly address the surroundings that you maybe feel alienated from, or the gods that you're not even sure are there, or you can bring out your harsh inner voice that you're too afraid to bring out into the real world in kind of metaphorical, dreamlike states. It acts as a shield, I've written there, because if what you're writing isn't really real, then no one can hold you accountable for it. And the two examples I've put here are House of Sleeping Beauties and Tales of Issa. Tales of Issa is a loose fit, but it's a lovely collection, and I quote it in Satellite Love. So House of Sleeping Beauties is by Yasunari Kawabara. It's a collection of short stories, some of his finest, in my opinion. And he won I believe he was the first Japanese Nobel winner for literature. I don't remember what year it was, but it was him and Mishima were in contention for it, and he ended up winning. And so House of Sleeping Beauties is a collection of short stories, and there's quite a few of them in there, but the two that stick out most to me are the title story, House of Sleeping Beauties, and another one called One Arm. And One Arm is probably my favorite short story. But House of Sleeping Beauties is a story about a business. It's kind of strange, and it's definitely a product of its times, but it's a story about a business. Like operates similarly to, let's say, a brothel, and back then, but rather than sleeping with the people working there, you literally sleep next to them. So you don't touch, you don't do anything. You pay to go and have a good night's sleep next to a naked body. And the whole book is kind of about this kind of disaffected, alienated, I think middle-aged man who goes and falls into the kind of whirlwind of this House of Sleeping Beauties, and it becomes very kind of difficult to understand what's real and what's not real. And Kalpana is not writing about a literal, well, he is, but he's not writing about a literal House of Sleeping Beauties, a literal place where you can go and sleep next to naked young people. He's writing about the loss of youth. He's writing about the desire to be young again. He's writing about the kind of transitory nature of beauty. But these are all pretty kind of controversial things, and I don't think Kawabata is necessarily afraid, but maybe part of him was, or at least writing in this magic realist kind of way allows him to talk about these things with a buffer and present this alienation the main character feels from his body and from the world, which no longer values his older body, into a very kind of direct metaphorical way. Tales of Issa is a collection of old, like Han, I believe, court poems, kind of about it's a very like classic coming and going adventures of this young man who fights in battles and has lovers and writes poems, and like one of those. But throughout it, there's a recurring theme of dreams. And there's a quote here: "Was it you who came to me, or I who went to you? I cannot tell. Was I awake or sleeping? Was it real or just a dream?" The context here is a woman who's writing him a poem about an affair they'd had. And she says she can't remember. It was so dreamlike. Was it real or was it fake? Were you here or was I there? And in the same way, this is kind of shielding herself and also shielding the audience from maybe the uncomfortable reality of like a very physical affair. So that's magic realism, and we see this so much in Japanese fiction. Not so much in convenience store women, but I would say I think her new one you could. I don't know if I'd call it magic realism, but you kind of could. Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. It's pretty shocking. It's legitimately one of the most gruesome novels I've ever read. It has like cannibalism and whatnot in it. But yeah, I get like her stuffed animals just talking to her, for instance, or the way she describes the act of cannibalism is very detached, and it's kind of using the same mode of thought maybe as Kawabata was using. Another one of the stories in this collection is One Arm, where a man's going on a business trip, and the woman, as a token of her love and a token of her missing him, detaches her arm from her socket and gives it to him, and it's so beautiful. One of the most beautiful love stories I've ever read, and it's about a man holding an arm like it's a baguette. It's really good. So we'll go to the next slide here. So how was that incorporated into Satellite Love? Well, magic realism allows for pursuit of higher truth. It erases conventional boundaries, especially in a more, you could say, restricted Japan. I don't really like saying that because it's just a matter of context. You know, things that are more restrictive here, less restricted there, but let's just use that for now. So in practice, Satellite Love plays with this. I wanted to play with this directly with the question of magic realism. The characters who are imaginary outright tell the reader, I'm imaginary, I'm not real, I'm a figment of Anna's imagination. There's no smoke and mirrors. It's very upfront. This is a magic realist book. What you're reading isn't really happening. It's all in her head, kind of thing. Something. But then the boundaries start to blur, and Leo, the satellite, who is unreal, does he start to become real, or when does the real become unreal? Where do the boundaries start to erase? Leo is Anna's magic realism kind of solution to represent her inner loneliness or inner anguish. She's unable to properly convey this to the world and properly kind of process these emotions. So instead, she creates a surrogate. She creates Leo, an imaginary character. But then that's where things start to get tricky because the unreal starts to get real. And Anna's characters are always appearing in dream states. She has a couple different imaginary friends, and often characters are falling in and out of sleep and appearing when other characters fall asleep, kind of hinting about who's real and who's not. And then, if anyone's read it, the book ends, without any spoilers here, but it ends with a dream. So I put a little quote here. The lines between worlds were blurring, as though someone had run their sleeve over it, smudging the ink. Who belonged where? And in a meta sense, too, it's kind of funny because Anna's real and Leo isn't, but also Anna's not real. She's a character. She's a figment of imagination, too. But can that have effect in the real world? I would argue yes. So that's kind of it for my little lecture there, or my little talk, let's say. Here's a collection of the titles mentioned in case any of them seemed intriguing. Strongly recommend pretty much any of them. So much good writing in the world. It's hard to choose. But yeah, thanks for having me, I guess. Thanks for talking about Satellite Love, or thanks for letting me talk about Satellite Love and Japanese fiction.
Thank you very much. I think people would love to hear about your process in terms of becoming a writer, especially because you began writing during university.
Oh, yeah.
And also you mentioned how time consuming or all consuming the publishing process was, and that it took a couple of years.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear about, or I think all of us would be interested, or some of us would be interested in hearing about that. So
Some is good enough for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm surprised I got my degree. I graduated during COVID. I graduated like in 2020. So I graduated on a Zoom call. That was a lot of fun. But I was complaining about graduating on COVID, but my younger brother started university in COVID, and that is much worse. So power to you guys for like taking online classes. My God, that's amazing. I wrote Satellite Love. Let's see, I was in university from 2016 to 2020. I started Satellite Love around 2017. So I would have been, I think I finished the first draft when I was like 19. That was like my goal. I wanted to write it as a teenager because it was a teenage book, and I'm very proud of how naive it is. So I wrote the first draft my second year, mostly with just the intention of having written something. I'd originally come up with the idea for the story as a short film because I was in film school. And then the longer I wrote it, the more I realized there was a gap between what I wanted the story to be and my actual like skills as a filmmaker, which are quite minimal. There's a reason why I'm talking about a book right now. So where was I? What was I talking about? Yes, I wrote it as a novel, mostly just to see if I could do it as like a challenge. My dad's a writer too, so I always wanted to give it a shot. I always see him writing, but I didn't tell anyone I was writing. I felt kind of ashamed of it. Um, and then that all started to change when Ruth Ozeki, who I met at a bookstore I used to work at, Book Warehouse on Broadway. I'm giving a shout out, like it's not on the other side of the country. If you guys are ever in Vancouver, go to Book Warehouse on Broadway, where I used to work. I met Ruth Ozeki there and chatted. She was really sweet. We got along. We had a lot in common. And then I ended up very presumptuously sending her Satellite Love, and she was kind enough to actually read it. Which, like in retrospect, I'm like, Jesus, I really sent like a hobbled together first draft, like Booker shortlisted Ruth Ozeki. It was very disrespectful almost, but she read it because she's an amazing person, and she really liked it. And I was so grateful for that. And then she passed me on to her agent, and then from there, that's kind of it. Just became the typical publishing process. Um, Publishing process, if anyone's interested, is you write a novel, you hope it's really good, and you cross your fingers a lot and hope it's good, and then you edit it a lot and hope it's really good. Once it's done, you write what's called a query letter, kind of saying, "Hi, my name is Joe Schmo. I wrote a book about a stick bug being eaten by a lawnmower. Would you like to read it?" You send it to a bunch of agents. One or two come back to you and say, "Yes, I would love to read it." You send it. Eventually, one of them says yes. They represent you, and then they start sending it out to editors. And then every step of the way, of course, you're editing it. Your agent wants to edit it, to fix things about it, to make it more like, polished. Your editors want to edit it. And it's a long process. I mean, I finished the first draft 2017, and it came out 2021. But it gets quicker, like once you have once you have like your team around you, once you have an editor and an agent. Yeah, and then I launched the book over the pandemic, which is super weird.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I called in sick to work, so I'm here for however long.
Hi, hello. I'm a Japanese, so I was kind of surprised that you wrote Japanese culture so well in English. And well, I want to ask you, what is the key to writing about Japanese culture in English?
Oh, thank you, that really means a lot to hear from you. Where in Japan are you from?
I'm from Saitama.
ああ、埼玉の。俺、九州、やっぱり前言ったね。みんなまた九州、熊本。Well, thank you. That's really kind to hear. Yeah, I'm half Japanese, but I grew up in Canada. I definitely, if I had to choose, would say I consider myself more Canadian than Japanese. So even though I lived in Japan, even though I speak Japanese, I'd like to think decently at least. Even though I have Japanese friends, getting the cultural aspect of it was really tricky. The matter of writing it, one of the best compliments I've ever gotten about this book, and your professor actually said this to me, and then in an event, someone else said it too, is that Satellite Love reads like it's been translated. And I love hearing that because that's what all I read is translated literature. I kanji zenzen yomenai. I can't read kanji, which is a huge blind spot to me. Kanji is the Japanese. There's three alphabets in Japanese. Kanji is the third one. It's very complex and it's derived from the Chinese alphabet. I'm studying it, but I'm not great at it. So I read translations of Japanese literature, which is an art in its own. I'm very keen on translators. Yeah, so I guess for writing that, having the lived experience of living in Minamata definitely helped. But so did research. Even I wrote an early draft of Satellite Love without research, and then when I sent it around, people had read it. They said the world, like, it didn't really feel like it had to. Like, why was the story set in Japan? It could just as easily be set in like a remote, icy Polish village, or it could be set in some like isolated town out in like I don't know Greenland. Why did it have to be Japan? And I realized that I was writing about the Japan I knew as though everyone else knew it. Because all these details were just inherent to me, or I assumed I knew everything about Japan, which is a very incorrect stance to take about anything. So I did a lot of research. I read so much about Shintoism. I think a big part of it was incorporating the culture and the mythology. I it talked about how Shintoism is integrated into the culture. So just by incorporating that, you get a better flavor of the Japanese character, or at least is what I was hoping. So even though not all of Japan is strictly calls himself a Shintoist or I'm a devout Shinto believer, there's still that feeling there. There's still that kind of emotion. So down to the way you describe the snow falling, down to the way you describe this or that. And of course, like whenever you try and describe anything well, if you're writing a book not set, I knew Japan, but if you're ever writing something set somewhere where you don't know, just the smaller the detail, the better. If you can like refer to a specific brand of Fanta that everyone in this one village drinks, then, and that's a real example from an author I know, then your writing has so much more like authority.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much for the question.
And can I ask you one more question?
Absolutely.
Yeah. When I was reading the novel, I found that you wrote about the Shina Ringo
Ah,
song and some other folklore, the
yeah.
song in Nomari-san. And like I was wondering, what were you thinking when
Yeah.
you were writing about those Japanese songs?
めっちゃ大ファンです、椎名林檎の。
そうなんですか？
椎名林檎、やっぱりそれだね。椎名林檎 is an amazing artist. I wish I was Sheena Ringo, just creatively. Everything she's like, holy, she's like Lady Gaga of Japan, but like 10 times more punk rock, or at least in the early stages of her career. And I'm a big fan of her. So I saw the chance and I thought, well, what kind of music does Hannah listen to? Well, she listened to Sheena Ringo, this hardcore. I mean, she was making music in the 90s. It was perfect. I got to plug my favorite musician, and hopefully expose a little bit more of the world to the cult that is Sheena Ringo. Makes me very happy to talk about her. Next book, I'll probably start talking about Blue Hearts or something.
So the song that you wrote in the book was the I guess the song about the mother abandoned the daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So like, is it like I kind of felt the connection of like the Anna was like the mother was not in her home for a long time and like yeah, so is it like did you make the connection of the
Yeah,
song
that was
lyrics
definitely
with the
deliberate.
novel? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a song about a child, a lost kitten who can't find her mother. And Anna sings as she goes through. It's kind of before you know anything about Anna's life, but clearly Anna's living without a mother, or she's living with absent parents. And of course, as she walks, the children's song that comes to her mind would be that one. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Wonderful. Yeah.
So it's a bit random, but how did you find the time to write more while you were in university? Because I would love to write more, but I just find myself so swamped almost all the time.
Yeah, that's a great question. What's your name?
Sorry?
What's your name?
Angelina.
Okay, thanks, Angelina. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, that's when you're so busy when you're in university, even when you're flunking out of film school like I was. Like I still have things to hand in, so I actually got my degree, right? And I'm maybe overstating here. Yeah, what I found with Satellite Love, it was a little bit, I wouldn't say easy, but I was so excited about the idea that it was all I could think about. It was all I wanted to ever do. Um, so I think what plagues a lot of writers, and this has kind of sometimes become a problem with me too, with now that I'm writing, other books, and I've written one, and now I feel like, okay, I have actually like I'm a writer now. I got to take this seriously. Is this feeling that everything has to be perfect in order for you to write? That you have to have like, okay, a nice hot cup of tea, and the weather has to be right, and you have to have music, perfect playlist, and loud, but not too loud. You still have to hear your own thoughts. Um, and I'm very guilty of that now, which is kind of funny, after I've already written a book. But the reality is there's no end to that, and writing should be instantaneous. And it's best, I found, with Satellite Love. I had a little iPad Mini and a little Bluetooth keyboard, and I carried that with me everywhere. And I wrote Satellite Love on Google Drive until Google Drive started glitching out at like 30,000 words, and I had to buy a Word subscription. I just wrote everywhere. I wrote on the bus. I wrote between classes. 30 minutes can fit way more writing than you thought. I wrote on my break at work. But I was like working too while I was studying and probably doing neither well. Um, I think how you make that happen though, because it's one thing to say like, oh, just write whenever you have time, like obviously, duh. But it's another thing to like sit down when you only have 30 minutes, and like, okay, be creative. How I did that was with Silent Love, I wrote a really solid outline early on, and that was something that's just pure craft that I learned. It wasn't like my own invention. I just found a really great outlining method online. And I'll just kind of briefly give an idea, but Satellite Love, when I was coming up with the idea for the novel, it was kind of like being in a dream state. You have these ideas, you have these characters, and you're just kind of writing in a long, messy text document. And then when you feel like you have enough, because okay, time to organize it. I broke Satellite Love up into, I think it was 27 beats, and it roughly came out to about 1 beat a chapter, which kind of lended to the very elliptical prose of the book. But and I always had this plan with me, and the beats would be like, Anna goes to the store, bold beat. She buys an onigiri. She talks to the clerk. They talk about what is outside, or something like that. Or I think or bigger plot points too, like Anna summons Leo down to Earth. He comes to her room. What else? Like I'm thinking, what else would happen? She tells him he doesn't exist. He phases through objects, kind of thing. So I always had this really big, I felt pretty comprehensive outline with me. And then whenever I sat down to write, I could just kind of pick up. Days where I felt creative and I got on a roll was great. Days where I didn't feel creative, I could still at least mechanically put down, well, Anna has to walk to the store here, so I'll write about Anna walking to the store, and usually it turned out better than you thought it did. Also, with an outline, like don't ever take it too seriously. It's like a roadmap. If you're on a road trip and you want to get from Calgary to Edmonton, then along the way you see something cool, you're gonna take a detour. Same with the book.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great question.
Other questions?
I see a question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
I'm watching the chat. Melissa Halford. Can you guys see this, or am I just talking to myself?
No, we can see this, and I think Ed is connecting Melissa so she can ask the question herself.
Oh, great. Well, I'd love, if Melissa wants to, I'd love to speak to her. My voice might have to answer just the question too.
Melissa, you can go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Hi, Melissa.
Hi, this is so cool. Thank you for giving me the gift of voice, Ed. Appreciate it. Yeah, I did put the question in the chat there. There's lovely artwork, like visual art, sort of scattered throughout the book at various places I really liked, and also very different from the cover artwork, just sort of in its aesthetic in some ways too. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that, please. And
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you, by the way. I also just want to say I'm just totally amazed with you as a human. I have been completely captivated by your talk. And my kids did the writing exercise with me, and it was a lot of good fun. So thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad. And you just got me talking on my favorite thing. Anyone, if you get to talk about their favorite thing, is going to go on a 2-hour ramble. So I just got allowed. I was just allowed to ramble. So I'm very thankful for that. Yeah, Satellite Love, I always feel, like I don't have to hold back from accepting compliments about how beautiful the book is, because it was completely out of my hands. I'm not a visual artist, but the book is so beautiful. Like the cover is gorgeous, and the illustrations inside are gorgeous, and that's all because of the designer Emma Dolan, who works at Penguin Random House. And I'll pull up. Here's one of the illustrations here. You can kind of see. So that's a komainu, which they stand at the entrance to every shrine. One has their mouth open, one has their mouth closed. It's meant to signify the first sound you make at birth is ah, the last sound you make is mm. But it's a half lion, half dog, and you can kind of see that when you look at it. But the phrase half lion, half dog it doesn't really put much in your mind. And you can describe it, but it's not as good as an image. So how that came about, I didn't pitch Satellite Love, or I never thought there would be illustrations. Of course, I was always happy about them. But I'd written the book, and my editor, Anita Chong, had actually suggested this herself. She said, there's a lot of Japanese elements here, and that's good because it's a book set in Japan. And one of the big things we worked on was not necessarily hand-holding. Early drafts of Satellite Love, the word kami, the word bento, the word onigiri were all in italics, because I was just used to reading, especially reading like old translations of Japanese works, where like the word sushi was like foreign, so they'd italicize it, like sushi, which is a food eaten in Japan. So I just got used to italicizing foreign words. And then my editor saw this and said, this is on the way out. your characters, Anna, Soki, the word bento, komainu, shinto, none of those are foreign to them. That's part of their world. The word TV, like, I don't know, the word like computer or TV, I'm trying to think of like Western words, those would be foreign, those would be italicized, but why would Japanese words be italicized? Oh, you're absolutely right. So we went through and unitalicized all the words. And that's kind of the beauty of writing the 21st century is you can challenge your reader more. If someone goes, what's a komainu? They can Google it. But to kind of remedy that and to kind of remedy the fact that it implies cultural understanding, Anita, my editor, suggests that we include drawings throughout. And there are these really beautiful pencil drawings. I think there's 5 or 6. Here's another one. The 5-yen coin. Go in. I describe a coin with a hole in the center. I mean, I guess you can kind of describe what it is, but being able to see what it looks like helps. And then, of course, I don't know if I'll be able to find it. Oh, here. The omamori, too. So there's all these really beautiful drawings throughout, and that was kind of an interesting case where you're definitely using like image to supplement text. Thank you for that question.
Other questions? Okay, well, it's been almost exactly 2 hours, so you're probably tired.
Oh, I'm good. If there's more
Say.
questions I can answer, but yeah.
Yeah, if anyone has any final questions. But otherwise, thank you so much. That was fascinating. It really added to, I think, our discussion of Japanese literature, but also this book in particular. We're going to be talking about Satellite Love next class. So we'll have a couple presentations on it and discuss it. So I'm sure this will contribute to those talks and papers. And yeah, just one final question maybe. What are you working on right now? Can you give us any kind of preview?
Yeah,
Kind
that's
of
a good
typical
question.
though.
That's a good question because no, but it's a fun question because it means I get to like sow the seeds of sales for the next book. What I'm working on right now, I hope would satisfy people who enjoyed Satellite Love. It tackles maybe similar themes, but I hoped in a more mature light. It's about, and it leans more on the Buddhism sides of things. It's about an artificial island, is what I'll tell you, an artificial island in Japan. But so many things are changing that I like almost am cautious. I had the worst feeling the other day. The worst feeling when you're working on any piece of art, and I did a lot of multimedia stuff at Emily Carr. It's the same no matter what medium you're working on, is when you get really close to the end, and then you realize that there's something you could add or change that would make it so much better, but it's going to take so much longer to do. And then you try to like talk yourself out of it. Oh, it doesn't need that. Anyway, so that's where I am currently. I'm hoping to send it off to my agent, editor later this month, but we'll have to see.
Wow, okay.
I
And the
managed to-
process should go faster this time, right? Because
I hope so.
Yeah,
I'd love it.
yeah.
It'd make it, yeah, it'd make it easier to continue writing these books. But yeah, it should go faster. I mean, there's so many factors in publishing. Being a writer is kind of funny. Here's something that no one will tell you. Being a writer is funny because when you're an author, and this stays in this room, but you're treated in publishing as both like an infant and like a savant at the same time. Like on one hand, you ask a question. Like on one hand, they're really great people and they have so much respect for the process and for the writing and they just love everything about writing. And it's sometimes like embarrassing, like when they like ask you like really, really minute favors and like, of course I'll do that. Like it's not a big deal. But then also, on the other hand, you ask a question like, hey, when is my book going to come out? And they'd be like, we'll tell you when it comes out. The whole publishing process is leave that to us, author. I don't know where I was going with that. It's just something that's on my mind lately. Hopefully it'll be up soon. But yeah, a lot of factors in publishing that I don't understand. So
Yeah. Well, thank you for this book. I really
Thank you for
enjoyed it,
reading it.
and I know a lot of other people did. It's one of the books, I have a few books recently. You put up 2 of them that I've passed on to other people and bought extra copies of to give to people.
Oh,
And
great.
this is definitely one of them. And in fact, today I had to grab another copy from somebody else, Melissa, actually, to lend to a student because another student wanted to read it and do some work on it. And it's been
Oh, that
ordered,
makes me
but
so happy
not
to hear.
yet. So, yeah. So yes, it's one of the books I've passed on, one of them that I've given to my 15-year-old too. And I don't think he quite finished it, but he's almost there.
That's good.
He was supposed to
Absolutely.
come, he's not well tonight, so, but, yeah, so thank you so much for your contribution to Canadian literature, to understanding of Japanese culture. And thank you for your generosity with your time tonight. I really appreciate.
Say the exact same to you. Thank you for your contributions as well. So it's been a pleasure. Always happy to talk about my favorite things.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.